Hello, and welcome to I'm a Fan of That, a podcast about all things fandom, told through objects, stories, and studies, with a bit of silliness thrown in along the way. Your hosts on this journey are Dr. Vivian Asimos, public anthropologist and pop culture academic, and me, pop culture writer and journalist, all-round enthusiast, Holly Swinyard. Join us as we deep dive into the wonderful and wacky world of fan culture, its history, the people who make it up, and the way we look at this ever-growing part of our society. Fair warning, we may well talk about some adult themes, use some adult language, and possibly get a bit nerdy about the whole thing. You have been warned. Hi, my name is Holly Swinyard.
And I'm Vivian Asimos.
And welcome to I'm a Fan of That, where we talk about the wonderfully complicated worlds of fandom through the objects that we love. Vivian, I brought something fun today. Can you hear it?
Vaguely, yes. Yeah. I have quite a loud patch that I won't subject people to.
Because I think today's object is a D20, or my entire bag of D&D dice.
I was trying to balance mine on my nose before, but it's hard.
Yeah. I am that person who, during any game of D&D, will stack them all up into a little tower. Like, balanced them. How many high can I get? Considering I have more than one set, obviously. I'm assuming you played D&D before. You must have done. Or tabletop role-playing games.
I have, very briefly. I don't have very many friends who play. Although I do now that I've been hanging out with much more nerds. But
you mean cool people?
But I had always really wanted to, and so during extreme lockdown, I convinced my partner to give it a try, and we did a 2-person one that I DM'd.
Aww.
And it was a little sad, but I think it was fun still.
It is fun. I actually have a lot of friends who play as a couple, where one or other of them will DM and the other one will kind of play, and it's sort of like communal storytelling, that you get to be in the story, which is great. I really like that.
Yeah, it was fun. I took way too long to plan it out for as simple as it was.
I mean, if it makes you feel any better, anecdote time. My friend Andy is a musician, and he wrote entire musical scores for the one he was playing with my other friend, his wife. And they're amazing. And they're just for him. He just got bored and made them. And one of them happens to be because they're doing the Labyrinth tabletop RPG in the style of David Bowie doing the Dance Magic Dance. And it's with all the voices. It's genuinely an incredible thing. And I'm like, this is just for you to play in your house. And he was like, yeah. I'm like, why? Okay. Right. Fair enough. The level to which people go to with this, because they just want to have fun. It's great.
Yeah. Well, that's what we're talking about.
Exactly. That's the whole point. It's like a nice segue into what we're going to do. I think we'll use tabletop role-playing games if we can, because we want to be generic about it. And D&D is like Hoover, isn't it? You know, which one is, or I don't know, iPod. D&D's become the I've forgotten what the word is, the general term, but it's not. It's tabletop role-playing games.
Yes, because there are a lot of different types. In fact, I think I listened to an actual play podcast, which is a whole nother thing that we could probably talk about. But these are podcasts where you listen to people playing a tabletop role-playing game.
Yeah.
And the one that I listen to uses a completely different system. That's Galaxy, I think, which is Star Wars originally based. But they used the system and put it in a completely different world. And
because you can use GURPS, you can use like the Call of Cthulhu one, which is the most unnecessarily complex one, but makes sense if you're playing Call of Cthulhu, but nothing else. Because it makes sense if you're playing a game where you have to have a sanity meter, but if you're not doing any other system, why would you need it? And yeah, there's so depending, and like you can have ones that are literally like a page long rules where you just have a table and dice and all this sort of stuff. So there's lots of different ones out there depending on how involved you want to get with the rules and how much you want to just tell a story with your friends. So, but D&D has become the one, I guess. And at time of recording, they've just had a huge load of nonsense going on about that with the original games license, or gaming license, I think it's called. But we won't get into that yet. Well, let's talk about what makes like tabletop role-playing games sort of fun and exciting.
Yes, I think that one of the most important things that you hear from most players would be that kind of need for escapism and need for playing when you're an adult. Often we think of playing as something that kids do, and that adults are very serious people who live their life very seriously. But that's not true. I mean, people play in all sorts of different ways. And this is one of the ways in which people play. And as an adult, in many ways, still quite similar to the way that children play, but also in its own way as well.
Yeah. I think tabletop role-playing games are quite interesting, and they're slightly, I don't know, they're kind of unique in it because they allow you this moment of working through emotions and stuff, which I think play is what it's meant to do, right? It's meant to help you understand the world, and as a child, like, learn things and all that kind of stuff. And playing sports and stuff and things like that can help you, like, can physically help you do that. But I think there's this weird emotional thing with D&D where you're like, oh, we're going to actually talk about our feelings right now, and then we're going to fight a dragon. The amount of people I know who like have like these really in-depth conversations, and like everyone's crying around the table and it got really hardcore, and then, oh, but now there's a amethyst dragon here, we have to beat it. And suddenly it's like, oh, all of that's forgotten until like we've dealt with this, which I think is quite funny, but also at the same time probably very cathartic and quite helpful for a lot of people to be able to sort of have a safe space where it's not you saying this, it's your character. You're hiding behind the imaginary thing, but you can deal with it.
Yeah, and I think it allows people to kind of play with the different dynamics of self in a way, and their own attachment to group dynamics. I think there's a really interesting things in regards to belief that, you know, when you were talking about people crying all together, I'm sure some people who maybe haven't played in this way might find that really strange, that if you're not this character and you're not going through, I don't know, fighting a dragon, then maybe why would you be crying? But I think this is where the dynamics of play, and particularly playing with levels of belief, is really fascinating.
I mean, yeah, because you are kind of starting to... It's that same attachment I think that people get when they get really into a movie or a video game or something, that you become so part of the world and part of the story and everything that, of course, you're connected to them in some way. And particularly when you've spent 2 years playing a long form game with your friends, it's going to become quite intense. So
yeah, but there's Richard Chechner is a scholar in the study of performance, and he has this distinction between make believe with a V and make belief with an F.
Okay.
I know, and they sound very similar, so I'm going to try really hard to stress it because I'm talking. But
just do like a little sound effect. Be like, this one. Yeah.
Make believe with a V talks about how in that dynamic of play with belief, it protects the boundaries between the world of the that you're creating and playing within and the bit outside of it.
Okay.
But make belief with an F intentionally blurs that boundary.
Okay, so that's a bit like, I mean, we've talked, both of us outside of this podcast have talked a lot about cosplay and things like that. Because actually that kind of place of, are you the, you know, when you put on a costume like a drag queen or whatever, there are two personas, but are they the same person? Is it sort of similar to that kind of performance level? Like when people go on stage and things?
So I think that Chechner would kind of see when you were talking about when you go to see a movie or something, that might be a little bit more similar to the believe with a V, where you go into a space, I'm watching a movie, I'm in it in that moment, and then I leave and I'm back into my normal space. But I think make belief is a lot more like that cosplay thing, or I would argue also like tabletop role-playing games where, you know, people move in and out of character very smoothly and easily, because it's not this, when I am sat here with the dice out, I am this character and I shall not be changed. You then kind of shift in and out, and you suddenly talk about how you're allergic to mushrooms or something, but in your actual world and not in your character world. And then you suddenly jump back to fighting a dragon, and you are able to move within those spaces. And the way that you were saying about how you start talking about things, and it's kind of you, but also kind of your character, and people know that, but are kind of playing into that as well. I think that idea of intentionally saying, you know, we're not going to specifically set these clear boundaries, and in fact, we're going to kind of purposefully mess them up.
the amount, it's that thing where you're sat there and you're doing the very important, okay, I've got to make sure that I play my thing right, we're getting all the exposition, all this sort of stuff, but chocolate biscuits are coming in, and now I'm excited about the chocolate biscuits in the same breath as this.
Because you always order pizza.
Exactly. You say that, my D&D group didn't. We used to cook for each other. Like,
oh, wow, you are...
It would be someone's job, and then it would be somebody else's job to bring snacks, which was always really nice. It was very communal, that's what I liked about D&D, was actually that it became almost like a sort of a very communal, like you ate together, you played together, everything was, you were all in the moment in that space. And it was very blurred. It was like, my character's called Chester. He's a half-orc artificer, and I love him deeply. Basically, I went, half-orcs are meant to be stupid. That's a terrible thing. I'm going to make him really smart and like Tony Stark kind of levels of stupid machinery and things he can make. Anyway, so it would be like, am I being this? That? But the chocolate biscuits have arrived, and now I want the chocolate biscuits. It's ridiculous. It's a very... You're right, it's an incredibly fluid space. You move through this, and you kind of get to the point where you don't know where the character ends and you begin. Like, you could kind of, you can see your own characteristics in it, but you can see their extreme versions, and you are playing a part, but then at the same time you're like, it's not really, because I would definitely do what this person's, you're only using your own experience within it, which is quite fun. I enjoy that. It's quite funny to play a character who's nothing like you. That's always an interesting thing to see when you see someone playing someone who is so the antithesis of them, and how they manage it, because you can't not put yourself into it, because you're sat there physically with other people.
Yeah, this has always been my problem, right? So I was supposed to be playing somebody at one point who was like really intelligent and clever and could like solve things, and I'm like, but I'm not clever. So what am I supposed to do? Because I still have to act as the clever person, but if I'm not clever, then what am I supposed to do?
One of us has a PhD and it's not me.
That's a very different type.
But no, it is interesting. Like, I've definitely had characters where I've had to play, like, where I've purposefully created somebody who is like very stoic and very kind of like, oh no, don't look at me, I'm going to be the anime guy who stands in the corner, kind of thing. And then eventually within maybe 2 sessions, it's like, no, they're not like that anymore, because I can't do that. Like, I can't maintain that for this long, which is very interesting, that it does blur so quickly to be like, I don't act like that, and so my character can't necessarily act like that. They're gonna have to have a bit of me in there.
Yeah. I think, one of the things that I've always found really fascinating about tabletop role-playing games from like a scholarly perspective is that it's one of the most interesting ways of telling stories where you as a player are both the audience and the storyteller.
Yeah.
See, I told you, not clever. But yeah, so you're both the storyteller and the audience at the same time, and that doesn't often happen.
No. And it's one of the things that I really like. So at the moment I'm looking really into role-playing games purely as the idea of like whether they blur the boundaries, and I put boundaries in inverted commas, you can't see that they're here. Yeah, air quotes, the boundaries between sort of the transformative and the affirmative when it comes to fan culture, because you can play D&D or whatever your tabletop role-playing game of choice specifically strictly to the rules and not change anything, or you can completely change everything and do it whatever you want and become like, you can transform it, or you can do both things at the same time depending on how you play it. And also, you were talking about live play games. People become fans of live play games and make characters based on them that aren't actually D&D characters, they're OCs. It's like you get this level of like fandom culture like building up on top of each other that it's like, this no longer makes sense if you're trying to be like purely like, nothing fits into 2 categories ever as far as I'm concerned. But like, if you're trying to look at it like that, you're like, this one doesn't work. It breaks the system. It's not working. It's quite funny. But then I think a lot of kind of things like this where you get that performative element, you have any kind of performance involved in it, which it does, like you were saying, you're the audience and the player, you're playing make-believe, all that kind of stuff. You can't be strictly one thing or another, because there's a human involved in the process, Well, there's always a human involved in the process, obviously, but quite literally you're there in the space doing the thing. So I don't know, it's an odd one. I'm going to do my I don't know voice. Vivian, you're the academic, help me. Like, when are you going to name drop somebody?
You know, I think the way that people engage with the storytelling is fascinating, both from an active perspective as well as a creationary. So there's, to name drop again, one of my favorite anthropologists of mythology is Levi Strauss. And he has this idea of the myth maker as the bricoleur, is how, because he's French. But basically saying that, you know, when you are making things, and he's talking about mythology, you grab at the things that are at hand in your culture and you use it to construct the stuff around you. He's a structuralist, so he's thinking literally of structure of it. But I think that the hint behind of what he's saying is really fascinating, that when we are creating stories, we do kind of just grab at what we know, and because we can't make something that we don't know.
No. Because as a writer, like, one of the things that I've always been told from, like, the get-go of, like, studying writing and it kind of becoming my job and everything, was being told there are no new ideas. Don't just do your own take on old ones, because don't try and think, oh, I've got to come up with something brand new. If there's a story that compels you, you can play with it and make it into your own version of that story, and that's just as valid. And that's that's the same thing, right? It's like, there are only 7 plots, or whatever, depending on who you look at. There's 9 or 7 or 5, depending on your academic of choice. But there's, like, the hero's journey. Everyone goes, oh my god, like, Star Wars and Harry Potter are so, I don't want to use Harry Potter as a reference point, but we're going to have to. Like, they're so similar. I'm like, yeah, because it's the hero's journey. Of course they're similar, right? You're just using the myth of the hero's journey in a different way. And I think that's kind of the same thing. That you do poach from other writers. You can't help it, right? There's stories you like, there's things that inform you as a person, and you're going to be like, oh, I'm going to take that thing. Which is why I'm going to be honest, we're going straight into fanfic and I'll leave again. But it's why I like things like, I've been watching Heartstopper, and I can watch it and be like, oh, this is really interesting because I can see that this is, I'm not sure if it is, but it feels very much like the beats of BBC Merlin fanfic. Like, the characters, I can line them up and be like, oh, this is this person, this is... And I, not to say that that's what it was or that what it was originally, but I can see that it's been informed by the fact that this person clearly did, like, BBC Merlin. You can see it. Or it was in the sphere of their influence in some way. And they're roughly the same age as me, I think, the author. So I think she was probably influenced by it, because it would be hard not to. It was a big TV thing at the time of when I was a preteen and a teenager. So it's interesting to see that and be like, oh, I can see those story beats from that thing here again. But that doesn't mean that this thing is any less good. It's still very good, just because it's been referencing or been influenced by this other thing.
Yeah, listening to the podcasts and stuff that I do, I can kind of pick up on what they're picking up on. And one of my favorites, also the way they tell the story, the narrator and even the characters when they're kind of explaining what their characters are doing and stuff. They describe it as if you're watching a movie. So like they talk about like cut to this thing and, it fades to black and then we come back to this scene. And it's like, that's not how you would say read in necessarily the same way. But they're clearly used to exploring narratives through a visual medium. And so therefore, when they're telling a story, they're doing it as if it's a visual medium, which is really fascinating when it's not a visual medium. I'm listening to them.
Yeah, they're literally using the cues, right? That's really interesting, because you talk about that kind of stuff with any kind of storytelling when people are like, oh, that chapter like cut away. And you're like, no, that chapter ended. It didn't cut away. It ended. It's a chapter, not a scene. But fine. I won't be pedantic about it. It's okay.
But yeah, there's different... We talked a little bit about how there's different game types and stuff, but there's different styles of play that people can kind of pick up and choose, and sometimes they're all meshed in one game as well, which is always really fascinating.
Yeah, I think it's interesting particularly because, again, that can be dictated by the game itself, but it's dictated by the players, because players have different play styles. You'll be able to see within a group whether you're going to mesh together if your version of playing D&D doesn't work with somebody else's. Like, I have, in my early days of playing D&D when I was at uni, there were just groups that I was like, this isn't going to happen. This isn't going to work, because that person and my play style, we just don't, they clash, Like, I had people who told me not to meta game, in inverted commas, because I wanted to look at the map that had been put on the table And they're like, oh, but our characters wouldn't know that. I'm like, yeah, but the map's in front of us. So if we're not meant to know, the map should be covered. If the map's there, it's available to us as people, right? And the DM was like, well, I don't know, we could do it either way. And I'm like, you DM are meant to make a decision about this. This should not be down to the players having an argument. But we were all, teenagers and learning how to play. So, it was going to happen. But it's interesting to see that, like, those two things of, like, what are we going to do here? Because one thing is, like, kind of, this is happening, but should we play it as if we the people do not have any idea at all about what's going on in any way, shape or form? Or do we have some knowledge because we're not the characters, we're ourselves? Can that inform our playstyle? So that's really interesting to see when that sort of stuff clashes. Like, people call it rules lawyering. Like, what are you, like, where in the rules are you going to pick up this thing to be like, no, you can't do this? And I think all of us do it at some point. I don't think it's a good thing or a bad thing. I think it's just a thing that people do. And particularly if you're like, you have massively overrolled your attack. How have you managed this? It's like, oh, well, I've got this and this and this. So it's interesting to see that play out when you're in a room with people as well, to be like, how are we going to work together as a group?
Yeah. It's an interesting kind of social dynamic, both of, at the beginning we talked about how lovely and communal it is, but obviously sometimes there are issues.
Yeah, sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes you...
But that's also really interesting, isn't it?
Sometimes there are arguments.
At the beginning, we kind of alluded to the fact that there is something that has recently happened with Dungeons and Dragons as an institution.
Yeah.
For people who are not as in the know of D&D news, would you like to explain?
It's really interesting, and I think actually it has a big effect on everything we've been talking about as well. So it's cool. So basically, Wizards of the Coast, who are the parent company of Dungeons and Dragons, they also have Magic Gathering, and they're all owned by Hasbro, so that gives you kind of a bit of information about the background of this thing. Essentially wanted to change the open gaming license, which is what allows people to take the rules set of D&D, the basic how it works of D&D, and transcribe that onto their own game settings. So say you wanted to write your own game, but you wanted to just use the rules of D&D, so it was easy for other people to either pick up or kind of move into a D&D setting and all that kind of stuff, which is what's been allowed for decades. That's absolutely been the way people have made tabletop role-playing games. That was suddenly going to be that you were going to have to pay massive royalties to Wizards of the Coast just for doing that, and that was going to be backdated as well, as far as the original leaked documents seemed to say. Like, it wasn't completely clear, but that seemed to be what it was saying. It would also say that, like, anything you wanted to do like that, whether you were doing open live play games that were using D&D, that would be included in this. Whether you were creating comics based off D&D content, so like if you were using like the terminology or the obvious, like the, that kind of thing. I mean, there's an argument that it's just swords and sorcery, right? It's just high fantasy, but if
it's all Tolkien.
It's all Tolkien. It's Tolkien all the way down, baby. But if you were kind of doing anything where you were like, even it, as far as it looked from like going through it, and I haven't gone into it as in depth a fine tooth comb as some people have, it seemed to be implying that even people who were selling like art of things like D20 Ranger or something like that, like a sticker or thing, would be included in this. No matter how much money you made off what was D&D stuff, you would be having to pay, and I think it was something ridiculous, like 20 to 25% of that in royalties to them. And obviously everyone went, absolutely not. You can't do that. This has been a game that's been around since the 70s, that has never had, the open gaming license has always been that everyone can just use this as they want, all that kind of stuff. Your D&D products are yours, and that's what you make money off. But if other people want to take some of that and make, it's not hurting you. And essentially it looked like a bit of a money grab. I would advise people to go and look up the Gizmodo articles about it. They have done some incredibly in-depth journalism into this. I think they were the ones who got the original leaked documents. So I'd absolutely go and recommend looking those up. And everything that's going on around it. Anyway, so D&D kind of went, Wizards of the Coast kind of backpedaled this and had a few kind of, oh, we're sorry, we're listening, you know, these kind of platitude comments and things. And they released a new version that nobody was happy with that either. Like, oh, but this is what we were going to do. And it was definitely because we want to make sure that people can't use the D&D stuff to make games about Nazis. Literally, that's what they said in their apology. And it was like, nobody, what? No, like you could have a different thing for that. You know, you can do that in other ways. So it felt very disingenuous.
It sounds like you just want to make money off of the game.
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
About Nazis.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, it kind of felt very disingenuous. And as of today, they have backpedaled on all of this and left it as it is, with then a new version, which is the 5.1, I think it's called. Which is like, which they literally said, this is still available and this new version's available. You can choose which one you do use. And it was like, oh, that feels very passive aggressive, but fine. It was literally like, choose which one you want. Like, that's what it said. And it was like, ooh, okay. At least that's how it read. I'm not sure if they intended it to be, but it didn't. Again, it didn't come across great from a multi-million-dollar company, particularly with Hasbro at the top of it. As far as like people have done some digging and like stuff like that, what it seems to be is that the current, and I'm going to get this wrong around, was it the CEO or the COO? Anyway, the people at the top of the pile for Wizards of the Coast are people who've come across from Microsoft, I think, and were instrumental in things like creating the subscription services for Microsoft and PlayStation, Xbox, obviously, and things like that. So they were very pushy on like people doing in-game things for Xbox games and like the Microsoft Windows thing where you now have a subscription service and stuff like that. Again, I am going off what I have found out through internet articles and all this sort of stuff, so I'm going to go with allegedly this is the case.
Yes.
Please don't come at me if I'm wrong. This is just from my own digging that I've been doing. And it just kind of seems to be that they were trying to put that similar sort of model onto D&D to kind of continue to make money out of it after people have sort of done the initial purchase, because they wanted to have a subscription service on what's called D&D Beyond as well, which is what players tend to use as their way of getting all the manuals and making, you know, it's the online sort of archive of everything. Where up until now you've sort of had you can just buy a digital copy of the books and things, whereas like this new way of doing things, and I'm not sure whether this has been backtracked on or not, would be that you would have to be paying $30 a month and you'd get everything, but you'd have to continuously pay your $30 a month or you'd have access to nothing. So you couldn't keep what you'd bought, essentially. Which again is problematic and not the way to play. You know, lots of people don't want to do that. They'll just switch to other things. And what I was saying at the beginning, the biggest issue is that because D&D has become the catch-all term for all of this stuff, that when people see a live play game switching from D&D to another play system, an indie play system or something that's maybe not so well known, it loses, like they've done number tests on it on live play games when they switched across to something else for like a few episodes or a different type of game or something, that actually it loses viewership because people who don't necessarily know that much about tabletop gaming are like, oh, well, it's not D&D, so I don't care, because they know that one, but they don't know any of the others. And so it's not as easy as just being like, okay, we'll go and play another game, because having that D&D tag, having that attached to it, in the same way that, like, you know, other vacuum cleaners are available, but I want a Hoover, I want a Dyson, you know, that kind of thing. They kind of have the name brand recognition, you know, the same as an iPod. Oh, I've got a different MP3 player, but everyone says iPod. Yeah. And so that's the thing I think that there's a slight issue with, is purely just on that brand recognition. But I think the likelihood is, because now they've backpedaled on this thing, which is in part, I would say, due to the fan base being rules lawyers, because what did you think was going to happen with people who've gone through every inch of manuals to know exactly how to do everything within it? What? Like, your whole fan base is made up of people who spend hours trawling through very complicated rules trying to learn how they work. That was never going to go any other way, was it? But also, like, these are people who, lots of them, not only for some of them is it their livelihood, but for a lot of them it is their community aspect, and you're threatening that. You're threatening not only you're saying, oh, well, you know, you can't do it. You're basically telling people who spend a lot of time just doing this as their hobby, they're now going to have to pay $30 a month to do their hobby. nobody wants to do that. Like, that's especially if you've gone from it just being free. You bought a book and now you can play the game, and you can choose how much you want to spend on it. But when somebody else is dictating how much you have to pay in order to engage with your community, maybe that's capitalism. But I think it was going to go down badly when a lot of people have, never had to do that. For this particular thing. And also, like, lots of people like dressing up as their own characters and making their own fan art and all that kind of stuff. And like, it felt like as much as it wasn't necessarily a direct threat upon that, it felt like it was threatening even that level of stuff, because people were being like, oh, so if I made a comic of my fan characters or my characters that I've made in my game, and then I wanted to put it on my Patreon, would that be, it was so difficult, that it became like that, and very, very complicated. And obviously, like, a lot of it was people worrying about things that might not be the case and stuff, but that doesn't change the fact that worry was there, and it set in that, like, the community was anxious about things, that they weren't it was so difficult to understand what they were talking about, and so, like, what does this affect, who is this affecting, all that kind of stuff. So even the people who it maybe wouldn't have affected were A, wanting to support the people it was going to affect, which of course they should, well done them, but B, being like, so what's this going to change to in the future? Will this mean that I can't do things down the road? So it was quite an interesting thing to see. But I do think it's probably pushed a lot of people towards things like Pathfinder, who have now released their own kind of rule set as an open gaming license. And, that kind of thing. And then, like, is it Galaxy, the one that's...
Yeah, it's it's from Fantasy Flight Games, I think.
Yeah, and like I said, like, a lot of other ones who already have open gaming licenses so people can use them were just kind of saying, like, well, you can use ours. So I think there will be a move towards people either going towards things like Pathfinder or designing their own. Just because I think this has been a bit of a wake-up call.
I think it's really fascinating to think about it from the perspectives of the, that kind of institutionalized versus individual narratives of, obviously, they're thinking of, well, we made this game that people are then using. But, when you sit down to play with your friends on a Saturday while the other friend is making food, apparently, as opposed to ordering pizza, do they really have ownership over that? Because at that stage, you have an individual who has crafted their own narrative over it. You have people who have created their own characters, who have created an intelligent half-orc instead of a dumb half-orc, have altered aspects of the game to fit their own perspectives of it. At that point, exactly. What role is D&D actually in that? Which is a really interesting thing to really look at.
I think treating D&D like it's a video game or something like that, where you are paying for the thing that you cannot change in any way, shape, or form. I mean, obviously you can if you mod or hack the games or whatever. But most people, when they buy a video game, they're playing the game, right? And so if you go, oh, we've got a DLC that you can buy, or we've got this pack that you can buy that go on top of it, people will, buy that because they want more of the content. But with D&D, you just have to get a book, and then you've got the book, and then you can do what you want. Like, that you don't need... So I think trying to treat something that behaves, like you said, in a way that the user interface, the people who are playing it, have so much more control over it, to the point that they can change it almost completely from what it was originally. And rule of cool, the whole thing, that was cool, right? If they're like, oh, is that a cool thing? Yeah, I'll let you do that. That's the thing DMs do. Like, it doesn't quite make sense, but you know what, it was really cool. So yeah, that's fine. That's so ingrained in part of the culture and the community of D&D that you can't be like, okay, cool, now you have to have a subscription service. I find it really interesting that they decided to try and do this. And it just feels like they didn't know their audience. They didn't know their fan base. It feels like the top people at the top, these people who were from Microsoft or whatever, were just going to be like, oh yeah, of course we can do that. Without thinking, no, you came to the wrong party. Literally. These people have swords.
Yeah, because, obviously, like, people like myself who maybe don't get to play as often, or are unable to, or uninterested in it, but also partake in it in other ways, particularly of, listening. Those actual play podcasts are obviously highly at risk, as well as many other things as well, which I think is really fascinating.
Yeah, like, I was trying to work out, and it was just part of the thing I was thinking about, was like, how does the Critical Role Amazon Prime show fit into this?
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, I wonder if that's what they were particularly suddenly going, oh crap, we could have been making money off of that, and not thinking about the fact that that's impacting, the individual person who just wants to cosplay as their OC.
I think that's exactly what they were thinking, and I think they were also thinking, oh, subscription services work in a vertical because they don't get cross with them, but we can do that. We can kind of force it in a subscription service into this so that brings us in money from the everyday player, and then actually what we want is royalties off these guys, or more royalties than we're currently getting off these guys. It was very much a money grab as far as everybody is concerned, allegedly. Allegedly. And it didn't work. And I think they're going to have to, on an individual... I think actually the only way it will work is if they, on an individual basis, negotiate with people who maybe like Critical Role or whatever. Critical Role is obviously the biggest one, right? Like, for people who don't know what Critical Role is, it's a live play game that started on Twitch, became incredibly popular around the second... Like, it got very popular towards the end of the first game, and then, like, into the second game, it just skyrocketed. And then since then it's sort of become its own company, and they make their own rule books and everything. But they also have an animated show based on the stories from the first live play game they did, which is now on Amazon Prime, called The Adventures of Vox Machina. And yes, Vox Machina, is that the first slot? I don't know. I'm not a Critical Role person. And it's done very, very well. They kickstarted that project themselves and all this kind of thing as well. So it was it hasn't seemed to have been particularly to do with Wizards of the Coast. So they do have links in now and collaborations and things like that. So I think that's it. It's actually something like that, which is now a I don't know if it's $1 million company or whatever, which is entirely based on D&D and has moved beyond kind of being D&D. Whether that was the trigger point for it, it may well have been. I wouldn't be surprised.
Neither way.
We can speculate wildly, but
allegedly,
yeah. What's interesting though is like the guys from the folks from Critical Role, and even were they very much came up and went, yeah, no, we're not. That's not happening. So it was good to see that like even the big names in the community weren't like, it wasn't just like a storm in a teacup. Everybody was upset by this. Everybody was like, what are you doing? This can't happen. Which kind of shows how, despite the fact that every community has problems and arguments and gets cross with each other, this really brought everyone together. So clearly, we proved the rule right of a ragtag group of misfits will join together to fight the big dragon, Because I was just thinking about like what you were saying about the thing of how important is the players, the dungeon master. That sounds so... I don't like that term. We're going to use game master. The game master, the players, all of that kind of stuff. Like, are they more important than the game itself? I mean, I guess the game gives them structure, and I guess if you're not the most super imaginative person to coming up with your own story or whatever, you've got a story to follow. But you're right. I think once you have the rule book, once you kind of know what you're doing, once you've got your dice, the other stuff becomes less important. That the game will play you playing the game, and you'll change it as much as you want, or how much or how little. And actually, how important is being able to get another rule book? How important is being able to make exactly the right character sheet, all that kind of stuff. I don't know. It's interesting. How important are the rules once you're telling a story?
Yeah, because especially, obviously people have flexibility to it. And, the one that I listen to that isn't D&D, but it's Galaxy, they have added their own system that's kind of like a tarot card. They've added into it where you can, they all have their own meanings to, it's not actually tarot cards, it's based off of some other board game. So they've actually combined a tabletop role-playing game with an actual board game, to then make their own tabletop role-playing game, which is absolutely fascinating.
And it's not uncommon either. Like, lots of people will do
Yeah.
that. They'll take one system they like and find a system, like you said, it could be from a board game, it could be from another D&D game, not D&D, another tabletop role-playing game, it could be from a video game even. Like, people take, it could even be like a legitimate like thing like Snap or something like that.
Yeah.
It could be, we're going to induce a mahjong element to this. You know, people do that, and it's really cool. I really like that people do that.
Yeah. So it's really fascinating whenever they kind of they flip the oracle card to figure out what happens whenever someone rolls even. So nothing, like there's no successes or failures. They'll flip an oracle card to figure out what happens. And then in other systems, they also flip the oracle card. So that's a whole system that they've kind of made up their own rule to, and has made their own game out of it in a way that I think is really fascinating. So yeah, it kind of goes into this idea of, again, people taking the stuff that is nearest to them to create their own narrative and construct it the way that they want. And it'll be interesting to see if Wizards of the Coast do stick to their guns on this, how much we'll see a hell of a lot more of that kind of stuff happening.
Yeah, exactly. Or if they try and bring in I would not be surprised that right now they're backing off, but I would not be surprised if we didn't see another attempt to do something like this in a slightly less obvious way, or like it's done subtly in dribs and drabs coming forward, which I think is the thing that means that people already are looking for other play systems. They're already looking for people who are not going to, so they don't have to be worried about it, essentially. And I think it's really interesting when people have house rules for their games. Like, when you're playing board games and stuff, people will always have house rules that are specific to how they've always played it, because it means that they've made either their lives easier or they've made a way of playing the game more interesting to them. Like, you go to any kind of... I was literally at my friend's house the other night playing board games, and we were just like, we don't really understand how this rule works, but we're going to make it work like this, because actually that informs our play of the game into a more fun capacity. Like, if we do this thing, will that mean that actually we get more enjoyment out of the game? Yes. Okay, cool. So we're ignoring that rule entirely because it's dumb and we don't like it, you know? But other people might be like, oh, that rule's great. I really love how that works in the game. So that's kind of fascinating, I think, to see house rules particularly, and how people are using that to inform their own version of it. Also, the ones where it's like a literal house rule that came out of being in a specific environment, where it's like, we need to have something to do the, and you end up with like the talking lemon or something like that, you know? And it's like, oh, just use that, that'll do. And it's like, it becomes something super informed of the party, but it literally came because you didn't have anything else to use. I think that's funny. A very old game I was playing, I think it was pre-lockdown, we had a magic spoon, and it was purely just because we needed something to stop each other talking over each other. So one of the characters we had a spoon that we were using, and then one of the characters in game was given the item of the magic spoon, and it could physically stop people. You gave it to somebody and they would be the only person who could, like, they had it within the sphere of magic so they could talk. And I liked that because it was like, we made a rule that worked for the game that also made sense outside the game. So you were both player and character at the same time. Yeah.
Blurring the boundaries.
Yeah, exactly. That's what the whole thing is, right? Maybe that's what we should have called this episode.
We still can.
We can, yeah. That's the name now. D&D, but tabletop role-playing games. Blurring the boundaries. Do you think this would make you want to go and play more D&D?
I mean, I've always wanted to.
Yeah.
I think the problem is that me and my partner are slightly geographically separated from, like, many of our friends. I think there's only one. I mean, obviously, I am massively, because for people listening to me, I am American.
What?
So a lot of, like, the friends that I grew up around, I mean, to be fair, I don't think any of them play, but even if they were interested, they're very far away. And then I spent most of my time up north when I was initially moved here. And my partner is also from Yorkshire, and now we're down south. And so it's like, I think one of his friends lives also down south, and that's it.
Yeah. And when you have adult lives, I think that's one of the things that people don't realize is actually it's quite difficult to arrange for, like, a regular game when you're all adults. because life just happens. And that's part of the play thing. I think people get so much out of it when they can do it, because when you are an adult and life is a lot sometimes, when you've got responsibilities and stuff, other priorities in your life, they, you have to kind of think, can I do my playing today? Am I allowed to do my playing today? And so I think when you have time for it and you make time for it, it becomes more important, because you don't get to just go out at lunchtime and play with a ball. You're not like, oh, bell's rung, I'm going to go home and, do nothing for the rest of the afternoon. You can't do that.
But maybe I'll try another couples one.
Yeah, you should.
It was a murder mystery one before, but I think I was using a D&D system, and actually I think a different system would be much more...
See, I think for a murder mystery one, as much as Call of Cthulhu is very complicated, if you looked for... There's a cut-down version of Call of Cthulhu that you could use. That might be fun, because it's all sort of... you're solving a mystery, right? You're looking for the eldritch horrors. Yeah. So it might not be a bad one to try. Though, again, the sanity meter... always a fun thing in that. How bonkers are you going to go throughout this game?
Maybe I'll just throw that in. I'll show him that there's a sanity meter and won't tell him why.
Well, dead body, right?
The whole time he's like, what's going to make my sanity go down?
See, I think it's quite funny. I have when I've played Call of Cthulhu with friends, we have a veto card. We have an actual card that's like an X. That's like, this is now too much for me as a person, not my character, but me now, right now. We have to take a breath because it's got too scary. I'm going to go do some, I just need to take a moment away from the table. We've only had one time where it was so bad that we had to stop the game. We were playing in a cafe and it just was like, yeah, this is too much now. I need to go home and think about what we just did.
Go home and hug someone.
Yeah, exactly. I was just sat there like, oh no, I don't like it anymore. We had to restart another day. It was quite entertaining. It'd been quite a lot quite quickly, because we were playing in a board game cafe, so it was a very intense game. And when you've got it, that you're with a magnifying glass and some photographs, and they're getting closer and closer to a horrific face after you've just seen rotting dead bodies, and then somebody's been following you, and all this you've just built up all these layers of things, and then suddenly you're you know what, this is the last straw today. This particular thing where I've been given an actual thing and it's real in my hands. You're no, I can't cope with that. I love Call of Cthulhu. I'm saying, yeah, I really enjoy playing it because, again, it gives you that's an actual visceral response to something that is in no way real, but it's so scary that you're okay, I'm going to have a cup of tea and then we can start again, It's very blurred. When, is it real? Is it not? Is it a play? Are you playing? Are you experiencing it? Yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah. There's a, this might be a little bit late to mention it, but there's a type of theatrical play idea by Stanislavski, who's a acting guy. But
is that what he is?
This is the extensive knowledge I have. Acting guy. No, but he had this idea of encouraging his actors and stuff to engage as if real. Mm. But he called it the magic if. Yeah, the magic if. So you're playing as if real, and it's a type of theatrical play with belief, and I think that there might be something kind of similar to that, a mix between that and the kind of blurry boundaries of Chechner, I think is a...
There is absolutely some horror novel, film, whatever, that uses that premise. Absolutely there is. I can guarantee you that someone's
definitely.
That's terrifying, and used it. But I think you're right. It is that thing of what if this is real? What if you're playing it? What if you turned around? There's actually a version of... Okay, just for the listeners to know, at some point in every episode I will try and talk about Lovecraftian eldritch horror because I'm obsessed with it. And I'm just allowed to in this episode because we're talking about tabletop role-playing games, and Call of Cthulhu is one of the bigger ones. But a friend of mine for a while, and actually I didn't play in this game, but they were doing it where they were all separate and they were sending letters to each other. And so it became really blurred that each character would be the game master would give them a piece of information, or they'd have to be looking basically they were doing things like looking for things that looked vaguely weird in the real world in which to incorporate into their next letter to the next player. And apparently was very intense, like very, very intense, and not necessarily for people who might not be of sound mind. Because you're like, where's the reality here? But also at the same time, like, that sounds like a cool escape room. Like, if you could do like a really immersive theatre experience for like a day that was like that would be amazing. And then just like, okay, cool, we need to go back to the real world now.
There was somebody who did research on ARGs, who was talking about how people were engaging with, how they have like those things of you call this number and then you get this information and then you go to that, longitude, all that kind of crap. But they were doing that, and apparently the way that they had constructed it was there was a phone number that you called. I think it was a phone number that you called. But the person who was playing the other side was pretending as if it was like they didn't know what was happening. And that was part of the clue.
Yeah.
But people were so, like, the few people who had reached out thought that they were breaking something. And so then they had, like, patched that up. And then they never talked about that clue. And the people making the game had to, like, try to figure out what went wrong. And what it was that people were happy to break the boundaries until they thought they had actually broken it.
Yeah, that's
and then
really
went,
interesting.
oh crap, and went backwards.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I think people with games, you hit a wall, right? The wall of reality. Where is it that we're breaking this? Where is it that it's going too far? And obviously for some people that wall is in different places. Yeah. Well, for everybody that wall's in different places.
It's like you have fun with that blurred boundary until you think that there is an issue, and then you suddenly go, ooh, like, I don't actually want to upset anybody by calling a number that they don't know what's involved in this, and that's not fair to them, so I'm not going to involve that when really it's an actor on the other side.
I feel like we're getting into LARP territory, which is quite interesting. So we will stop before we talk about LARP, because I think actually LARP itself is a really interesting topic that we kind of need to give time to. Because I think role-playing games, we said this before we started recording, role-playing games do verge on LARP. There is an element of live action roleplay to playing a tabletop role-playing game, I would say, depending on how into it you get. But it's not the same as like a full-on immersive LARP. And immersive, I would really like to talk about immersive theatre in regards to this as well, because I think it's very interesting.
I mean, when you talk about, at the beginning we kind of talked about people and how people like to not fit into categories and break things, and I think that particularly nerd fandom, like LARPing, and I'm saying nerd affectionately,
nerd brackets like, affectionate close brackets,
cosplay and LARPing and tabletop role-playing games and drag. There's so many similarities and relationships between them where you can kind of maybe look at a group of people that are wearing normal clothes, sat around a table playing a game, and you can go, okay, that's that. But then what if they're dressed as their characters but sat around the table? Is that... okay, well, I guess that might be more like this, and then what if they're acting it out while they're playing the game, and now you're getting into these way more blurred of boundaries that I think is really fascinating.
Exactly, and I mean, because it's funny, because I've done a lot of in-depth studying and stuff around cosplay, as you well know, and the amount of people who will talk about cosplay as one thing, and LARP as one thing, and historical reenactment as one thing, and then drag as one thing, and then blah blah blah, and you're like, these are all the same thing. I'm sorry, they're separate. They're like little subsets of it, but they are kind of, when you get down to the nitty gritty of it, they're pretty much all the same thing in one capacity or another. It's just your flavor of dressing up, and I say this all very affectionately with a lot of respect for all of it. But I don't necessarily think the categorization is necessary. But
on a different episode, I'll probably tell you about how I structured my interviews purposefully to make people start questioning themselves.
And I'm very excited for that. But I think before we talk about every other episode we're going to do, we should close this one off. This has been really interesting.
Yeah, I think I had a really good time, and hopefully other people did too. Thank you for chatting with me about the D20 and allowing me to name drop academics and also talk about play and my attempts at a 2-player tabletop role-playing game in the middle of a pandemic.
Thank you for teaching me about academics, because I always find that interesting. It means I get to go and do some reading afterwards and then scratch my head like, why is academic language like this?
I'll send you some readings.
Thanks. Actually, we can have readings. We'll have the readings for people if they want to on the, and I will put the links to the Gizmodo articles and the other articles about the Wizards of the Coast open gaming license for people who are interested in going down that rabbit hole, which is great. And I think we'll also, because we've talked about live play games, we'll link to some live play games for people to have a listen to as well, because they're great fun if you've got 4 hours to spare to listen to one. Clear your afternoon. So I've been Holly Swinyard, and
I've been Vivian Asimos.
And thank you for listening to I'm a Fan of That.
Thank you for listening. Remember to like, review, and subscribe wherever you are listening to this podcast, and do give it a share. Tell your friends, family, fellow fans. Get the word out however you feel like you can. You can follow us on social media. Links are in the show notes, as well as some links to further reading for anyone who might be interested. Music for this episode was Nowhere Land by Kevin MacLeod, licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 3.0. This episode was produced by Vivian Asimos and Holly Swinyard.